Get started. Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Wednesday night at the lab. Oh, should probably turn on my mic. My name is Elizabeth Moore, and I'm employed here for the Science Outreach Program at UW-Madison Biotechnology Center. On behalf of Biotech Center, UW-Madison, Division of Extension, Wisconsin Public Television, the Wisconsin Alumni Association, and the UW-Madison Science Alliance, I would like to thank you all for coming out tonight to Wednesday night at the lab. We do this every Wednesday night, 50 times a year. Tonight is my pleasure to introduce Will Bike. Tonight, Will share about snakes around town, the baseline snake species, occupancy in Madison Area, Prairie restorations. Sorry, mouthful. So we have like 5 questions we start off every lecture with. And the first one is, where were you born?
I was born in Milwaukee. I guess I was born in Milwaukee, and then I've lived in around the area most of my life. A little bit in Whitefish Bay, and then most of my time at Shorewood.
Awesome.
Just
and,
north.
Where did you go to high school?
Shorewood High School, the Greyhounds.
Nice. Where did you go for your undergrad degree?
Right here, UW-Madison, and just graduated in May.
Awesome. And what did you study?
I studied biology and history.
Perfect. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome me in joining Will Bike.
Thanks everyone for coming here tonight. As Elizabeth said, I'll be talking to you about snakes tonight. We just went over a couple of these points. A few things to know about me: I'm from Shorewood, Wisconsin. It's just on the northern border of Milwaukee. I'm a class of 2022 Badger with majors in biology and history. And most relevant tonight, I like snakes. So I also want to mention how I'm here tonight. Of course, my family, I think a number of them are looking at this over Zoom or over the internet. Thanks to them for making it possible for me to be here tonight. I also want to thank Jen Callahan, who I also think is listening in. She was a citizen science coordinator at the Urban Ecology Center and taught me everything I know about citizen science, about snake surveying. So thanks to Jen and the Urban Ecology Center for their great programs. I also want to thank Professor Seth McGee in the Biocorp program here, who told me that there weren't any snakes in the Lakeshore Nature Preserve. And then I said, bet, and I'm still on the losing end of that. Also, my professor, Catherine Woodward, who took me to Ecuador through the SEBA Foundation for Tropical Conservation, encouraged me to continue studying herpetology, and then also was the advisor for this project. Thanks to Dr. Catherine Woodward. I also want to thank Dr. Gary Casper and Robert Hay, who's the former DNR herpetologist. They advised this project as well with their expertise in herpetology, and I got in contact with them through Wisconsin's Green Fire and the Aspiring Conservation Professionals work group there. Also want to thank the Holstrom family for providing the funding for this project through the Holstrom Environmental Research Fellowship. And then I also want to thank the Friends of the Lakeshore Nature Preserve. That's how I met Tom Zinnan, and the most direct reason I'm here tonight. So thanks to everyone there. I'm also thankful to a wise high school teacher of mine who once said, and this is a lesson that's stuck with me: if you see a snake with scales that are red on black, he said, don't pick it up. If you see a snake with scales that are black on yellow, he said, don't pick it up. You see a snake with scales that are yellow on red. This one's a little more tricky. He advised us all, don't pick it up. He said, if you find a snake with scales of any other color, what don't you do? Pick it up. As you can see, and you'll see in the rest of this presentation too, I took this lesson to heart. Picked up a lot of snakes, about 140 last summer. I say all this because I picked up snakes, but I did so with the explicit permission of the university, and then also through a research permitting process with all of the different parks and preserves that I was in. So Dane County Parks, Madison Parks, the Uw Arboretum, UW Lakeshore Nature Preserve, and then my handling of animals was approved through RARC here at the university. So if you love snakes and you want to go pick them up, I know that sounds important to lots of people, but I'm one of those who does enjoy it. The snakes would rather be left alone. But if you can do so through a means that benefits the snakes through your research or through another organized activity like a citizen science project, that's awesome. So find those ways to look at snakes productively. Otherwise, keep your distance, be respectful, and observe them from afar. So I want to give everyone a little roadmap of what we're going to talk about tonight. So we're going to start with what a snake is, a little brief tour of their evolution and taxonomy. We're going to talk about why we should all care about snakes, their ecology, and some sensitivities they have to urban environments. I also want to talk about what I uncovered last summer with my study of snakes around Madison. And then I'll conclude with a brief talk about the snakes and their role in urban restoration ecology. I want to also check here, is everyone understanding me well thus far? Awesome. So we'll jump right in. What is a snake? Snakes, just on a very like 3,000 foot level, they're legless lizards, right? Or they look like legless lizards. And they evolved as terrestrial burrowing reptiles. This was just discovered a few years ago because the scientific community was split for a while between whether snakes evolved more as an aquatic species or from more of a terrestrial burrowing type animal. And it was discovered by this study, Bergoglio, that most likely snakes evolved from terrestrial burrowing ancestors. On the right here, you see an artist's depiction of the Josh snake, which is a Cretaceous legged snake. You can see here in the very corner, it has little legs on the back. But while most snakes have lost their legs, there are still some species of snake, like snakes in the boa family or the Boidae, that do maintain, they're called spurs. They're little bony attachments to their pelvis that they do use for locomotion. So they're not just vestigial legs, they're actively used functional spurs that allow the snakes to grip onto branches or the ground, and then they can also sort of walk these spurs to move the back of their body, which is pretty cool. So snakes aren't necessarily legless, depending on what your definition of a leg is. But how you can tell the difference between a snake and another lizard, especially given that there are legless lizards that are not snakes, is the fact that snakes don't have eyelids. So if we look at this depiction here of this ancient Cretaceous snake, it doesn't, at least the artist has not depicted it with eyelids. And that's a factor you will find in all snakes on the world today. And if you do see something that looks like a snake, but it does have eyelids, it's not a snake, it's a lizard, like this one here. So why snakes don't have eyelids is because all snakes are predatory. And if we think about how they evolved as burrowing animals, borrowing off of this study, if you're burrowing after your prey, you don't want to have to close your eyes, right? Because then you can't see what you're going after. And so snakes have evolved more of a windshield that covers their eyes that they then can shed off with their skin. And so if they get scratched or dinged up, they just get a new one in the next time they shed. So this is something that we can trace back to that burrowing ancestry, but is also very useful for snakes today as they do hunt visually and then also very much through their smell. Another really important thing about snakes is that they're exothermic, and that's just with herps generally, lizards and amphibians. And we'll talk more about this being exothermic and being cold-blooded throughout this presentation, but cold-blooded, I do want to say right up front, is a bit of a misleading term because snakes do still regulate their body temperature. They can have really high body temperature, they can have really low body temperature. In fact, their temperature is going to vary more widely than mammals like us, but they do that behaviorally. So instead of our bodies burning a bunch of energy to keep us right around 98.6 degrees, snakes will just move themselves into a warmer spot or into a colder spot, and then their body will just take on the temperature of that environment. So they're getting heat from the outside, so exo, and then thermic for heat. I do want to give you all a brief little intro too into how to identify different snake families as well, because once snakes evolved, they've diversified since then. So in Wisconsin, there are two main families of snakes. There's the Colubridae and the Viperidae. And this is of use to residents of Wisconsin because Colubridae in this state are non-venomous. Viperidae in this state are venomous. Our rattlesnake species are in the viper family. Interesting thing about the Colubridae is if you do go outside of Wisconsin to either southern United States or other parts of the world, oftentimes the colubrids will be the most venomous snakes, but the rule works within the boundaries of this state. So one of the main ways you can tell, and you may think this is not very useful because you may have to get up closer to the snake than you'd like to tell this, but Colubridae, they have circular pupils. So just like we have circular pupils, if you see a snake that it has an eye that looks roughly like a human eye, you can tell, pretty much with certainty here in Wisconsin that that's a colubrid snake. It's not going to be venomous. They also have more of a rectangular head shape, as you can see here. And that's in opposite, or I guess it distinguishes these snakes from the Viperidae, which have more of a slit pupil. So you think of a cat's eye as like a vertical slit. These vipers have very similar eyes. So if you see a snake that looks like it has the eyes of a cat here in Wisconsin, definitely stay away from that one. And they also have more of a triangular, almost broad arrow-shaped head. So if you look at any rattlesnake, or even like tropical vipers, they all have this very sort of broad arrow-shaped head that is so distinctive of vipers that some colubrids will try to make their heads a little bit wider because their jaws are so nimble. They'll just kind of extend their jaws out and try to pretend like they're vipers to scare you off. So just a fun fact there. So now that you're all prepared, imagine you're out in the field looking for snakes, and just like me, you have all these boards laid out in a bunch of different prairies, and you flip a board over and whoa, you see a bunch of snakes. You have to make a split-second judgment of whether these snakes are venomous or not. So let's say you flip over the cover board and you see this snake staring at you. Wow. Well, it's got some kind of scary colors. It's got reds and stripes and all sorts of things. What do we think? It also has this, it does have a very distinctive circular pupil. So here, that would mean this is a colubrid snake. Here, this snake particularly is a milk snake, an eastern milk snake. What about this one here? Really broad head. Definitely has a slit pupil. Venomous. Yeah, be careful with this one. This is a timber rattlesnake. We have those here in the state. And in Dane County, are you going to find one in Madison? Probably not, but west of here. What about this snake? It's really got it's got a big head, though kind of more rectangular looking. It's got a big mouth too. It's definitely got teeth, so it's going to hurt regardless of whether or not it's venomous, right? But you can see here that maybe on this image, the pupil looks a little bit like a slit, but if anything, it's horizontal, not vertical. So this here is another colubrid snake. This is a northern water snake. Have these in Wisconsin as well. They're often mistaken for cottonmouths. We don't have cottonmouths, and people are afraid of cottonmouths because they're venomous. These northern water snakes are not venomous because they're colubrid snakes. This one here is kind of a trick question. It's really stocky, and that's usually a sign of rattlesnakes. Rattlesnakes tend to be really burly snakes. They also do have rattles. This snake here probably benefits from looking like a rattlesnake. It has sort of similar coloration. It's got this orange that kind of just screams like, watch out. But this snake here, it's got this really distinctive, it looks like a hognose on the front of it. It uses it like a shovel to dig out toads and things. And that's why its head is so wide so it can swallow a whole toad. This is a hognose snake. And we do have these in Madison as well. Though it is a little ambiguous, right? If you were to come across this in the dark, you wouldn't know. You wouldn't know. So the right answer is always don't pick it up. So why care about snakes? This study here made the news a few weeks ago. It was published in Nature and is a global reptile assessment highlighting conservation threats around the world for different species and types of reptile. So I've circled here that agricultural and urban development rank as the highest threats to the most species around the world. And you see here that snakes are sort of this blue-gray color here. So agricultural development and urban development really impact snakes around the world. And you can see here that the number of species that are threatened around the world, a lot of them are really located in the tropical areas, right? And that's because snakes and reptiles, just like most other species on this planet, they follow a latitudinal gradient of diversity. So, most of the diversity of life on this planet is going to exist in that tropical belt around the equator. Wisconsin, we can see up here, is definitely a fair bit north of that, right? But we still do have a number of snakes here in Wisconsin, and they still are really integral to our native ecosystems. And they're facing a lot of the similar threats that their brethren in the Amazon or in Bangladesh are facing as well. So here is a list of all the snakes in Dane County. I do also want to add that there's a total of 21 species of snakes recorded by the DNR in the state. Of those 21, 9 species are species of special conservation concern, and 4 are endangered. So more than half of the snake species we have are considered threatened. So we have 16 of those species here in Dane County, according to Wisconsin's Dnr Range Maps. And I really recommend the DNR as a resource to look up information about snakes. They have all sorts of pictures, and they have these really nice range maps that tell you by county where different snakes are. So it's a great resource. These are the snakes we have here in Wisconsin. I'll also note in Dane County. There are 2 venomous species recorded in Dane County, the eastern Massachusett and the timber rattlesnake. We also have 2 endangered species, the Massachusett and the western ribbon snake here. Are you going to find any of those snakes in Madison? Most likely not. If you find them at all, that would be really cool, but definitely enjoy them from a distance. There are a number of special concern species as well, including the Plains garter snake, which we'll talk about later in this presentation. So I want to touch on how integral snakes are to our native ecosystems. They've been here since the glaciers moved out. And they do have, while not the same diversity you'd find near the equator, they do have a fair bit of diversity up here in Wisconsin. So they are the most abundant reptile taxon here in Wisconsin. We don't have lizards like they do in the South. We do have lots of turtles, but not as many species as our snakes. So the snakes are really one of the true representatives of the reptile taxon here in our of the reptile family here in our ecosystems. They're also all predatory. They're all mesopredators. And when I say mesopredator, I mean, I guess that's referring to like a trophic ladder, like a food chain in our ecosystem. So we think about the plants as being the base level of our food pyramid here. And then up from there, snails and insects and herbivores are eating those plants to gain the energy that those plants just synthesize from the sun. So energy is flowing up into the snail here in this diagram. Snakes don't eat plants. They would be eating the snails, or what's eating the snails, right? Or what's eating the snails. And so they're up in these sort of mid-range trophic levels and are considered mesopredators. We go all the way up to the top, you have apex predators like wolves, eagles, even like coyotes around here would sort of be an apex predator. Snakes oftentimes don't make it up to the top because, if you're the biggest blue racer in Wisconsin, you're still going to be terrified of being picked off by an eagle, but you're pretty much going to eat anything below you. And what's cool about snakes occupying these mid layers of an ecosystem is that they're exothermic, like we talked about before. So they don't use energy to keep themselves at a certain temperature. So they can eat, a bunch of snails. And most of those snails are not going to be burned just to keep the snake at 98.6 degrees. Most of the carbon and the mass in that snail is just going to go right to making more snake. So snakes grow throughout their lifespan depending on how much they're able to eat and how little they burn doing other things. So they're this really important reservoir of biomass in our ecosystems because they're not constantly burning it just to maintain a high metabolism. So they change the flow of energy in our ecosystems and really facilitate more energy being transferred from the plants that are soaking up all the sunlight all the way up to our apex predators like eagles. So they play a really crucial and interesting role here in Wisconsin. This is a visual here of just comparing the metabolism of three comparable creatures, all about the same trophic level. So robins, northern short-tailed shrew, and the common garter snake, all really like eating insects, slugs, worms. But if you look at this, the American robin, and the y-axis here is O2 per milliliter per gram per hour, and that is kind of an arcane unit, but it measures metabolism. So the oxygen you're taking in is being used to break up the carbon that you've eaten, and then you exhale the CO2, which is just the pieces of that carbon that you're exhaling. So the amount of oxygen you use is proportional to the amount of energy you're using in your body. So here, American robins and northern short-tailed shrews use over 10 times the amount of energy just to maintain their metabolism in the day than a common garter snake. So that garter snake is going to have magnitudes more left over just to grow. So this is just a visual of the stark difference in metabolism that snakes bring to these sort of middle tier trophic levels that other animals like birds and mammals don't. So unfortunately, a lot of our native ecosystems, as was sort of touched on in that global study, are being eaten up by our urban environments, right? And I want to say right off the bat that our urban environments are still really ecologically relevant. There are still a ton of species, wild species, that live with us in our urban areas. And there are also lots of great parks and refugia within our urban areas. Like here's basically a satellite view of Owen Conservation Park that provide these really great ecologically relevant places for wild species to live. But that aside, Owen still exists in this fragmented human environment, and all of the built infrastructure, all of our automobiles, all of our human activities are really perilous to snakes. And so urban snakes face reduced mobility and increased mortality in urban areas. And this is largely due to roads, pollutants, domestic and feral animals. We think about cats as going out there and killing birds. They'll just as happily kill snakes. And human hostility as well. Unfortunately, people are afraid of snakes, and that makes sense. But that does often lead to some miscommunication and letting fear take over. So this makes us wonder, how can we recreate and replicate functional native ecosystems within our urban environments? And are snakes going to be a part of that? So sort of the crux of this study is, like I said, the DNR has these great county level range maps. So here, this is for the Plains garter snake, a species of special concern. They say, Dane County right here is shaded in blue. Plains garter snake exists in Dane County. That's awesome. So now, does that mean that it lives in your backyard here in Dane County? Does that mean that it lives at Owen Conservation Park? Does that mean that it lives here at the Lakeshore Nature Preserve? Even though the Lakeshore Nature Preserve it has prairie, it has forests, it has wetlands, it has borders between all those three. It has plenty of rodents, plenty of frogs and toads. Can we just assume that snakes are going to be here because everything they need is here? Well, we have to think about, yes, the preserve is ecologically relevant, but it also exists in this really fragmented, perilous environment. So we can't really say that snakes live here without actually going to look for them. So the purpose of this study was to collect baseline snake population data at the local level here in Madison, the local level being individual prairie restorations. And when I say baseline, I mean that we really didn't have information about this before, right? So this is just the foundation that I was building here this summer. And, while there have been a few studies in the Arboretum, people report snakes all the time on iNaturalist, talking with land managers, there really had never been dedicated snake studies at any of these restorations that I visited. So I went out and did it. So how did I go about looking for snakes? I had a bunch of these boards, just called cover boards, or if you want to talk in herpetology speak, they're artificial cover objects. I just call them boards. My brother worked at a lumber yard, Blifford Lumber and Hardware in Milwaukee, and so I called him up and I was like, "Hey Nate, I need a bunch of boards." And he was like, "Well, sweet, we got those." And I was like, "Okay, well, give me 50." And he was like, "Gosh, Will, what are you doing, building a house?" And I'm like, "No, I'm just gonna go lay them out in a field." So that's what I did. I laid a bunch of boards out in a bunch of different fields, prairie restorations. And then I biked around Madison, broke the pedal crank on my bike somehow, looking, finding these boards, flipping them over, and then finding snakes. When I found snakes, I processed them, identified them to species, and then I let them go on their merry way. I didn't mark them or identify them any other way. So I'll be talking about snakes in terms of encounters, not in terms of individuals, because I can't be 100% sure I wasn't finding the same individual a few times. But it's tough to run mark and recapture surveys on snakes. So I was talking about those different prairies. Here's a map of the Madison area. And I think now is a pertinent time to talk about how, looking at this land, it's only recently been called Madison. It's been called Dejope since time immemorial by the Ho-Chunk people, who were through decades of ethnic cleansing by the US government. The US government unsuccessfully tried to remove them from this land. We should acknowledge that history of colonization, and it should inform our understanding of this place in both the past, the present, and especially the future. So that's really important to me. I want to put that in here. These are all the prairies that I surveyed last summer. Starting up here at the top, Pheasant Branch Conservancy. I had 2 different board arrays there, 10 boards in each array. Owen Conservation Park, which you've seen a little bit earlier. Also Overlook Prairie in the Arboretum, Overlook Prairie and Green Prairie is right here, this pink flag. Those were the 2 sites I had in the UW Arboretum. Also Prairie Ridge Conservation Park, I had 2 board arrays there on Raymond Road. The Biocore Prairie and the Lakeshore Nature Preserve. Serval Point Conservation Park, right on John Nolan Drive. And Lake Farm County Park, down sort of at the south and east end of my range as someone biking around doing this. So here is all that I found. Pretty much most of the results that are worth speaking of, I fit here in this figure. I don't expect you to read everything. It's a complicated graph. But what I'll say, there are a few key things I want you to take from this. I found snakes, 140 snakes, or at least I had 140 snake encounters around Madison. I found 5 different species of snakes, and don't worry, we'll zoom in on these sites and talk about them in more detail as well. I also didn't find one snake at all sites. I also didn't find snakes in general at all sites. I didn't find any snakes at the Lakeshore Nature Preserve. I also found certain species only at certain sites. So Prairie Ridge, I only found, I guess the only place I found Plains Garter Snakes was at Prairie Ridge. The only place I found milk snakes is at Pheasant Branch. So it seems, there's already some heterogeneity or, differences at this local scale that you don't see on those big county range maps that the DNR has. So those were the key points just to take from this overwhelming figure here. So now we'll zoom in. We have Turville Point Conservation Park. I was in I guess my boards were in a 4-acre prairie restoration. You can see here right on the point. This place is managed by Madison Parks. Turville Point is really interesting because it's really nestled in this really urban area. So if you look at land cover within 1 kilometer of the park, 38% of that is impervious, meaning it's concrete or metal or parking lots, roads, all sorts of things. But it does have this this sort of corridor along Winger Creek that connects it to the Arboretum. So there is some potential for movement. All snakes can swim. Whether they do or not, I can't say, especially these small-bodied Decay's brown snakes, which I found in abundance here just in this tiny little 4-acre prairie restoration at Turville Point. I also found Decay's brown snakes at the UW Arboretum, at Owen, Pheasant Branch, and Prairie Ridge. These snakes were the most widely abundant species that I found here in Madison. And this sort of fits with some previous data that had been collected mostly on the East Coast about urban Decay's brown snake populations. Surprisingly, these snakes have been found to live in really high local population densities. So sort of like what I found here at Olin Turville, that you can have a really small spot and have a lot of snakes. And this is why, and again, just for some perspective, these snakes are pretty small. Maybe not more than 6 inches usually. And they really like to eat slugs and worms. That's kind of their specialty. They will burrow through leaf litter and all sorts of, trying to find those moist places where slugs and worms like to hang out. And there's we usually don't have a scarcity of slugs and worms. You can find them most places. And so wherever there are slugs and worms, these Decay's brown snakes are happy. And so that they can exist in these small places where you wouldn't expect them to be. And that may even be an advantage for them, because there aren't larger snakes like milk snakes, which we'll talk about later, that would be eating them. So they can sort of exist in more of a less pressured way without competition from other snakes, while happily eating all the worms and slugs they can find. Lake Farm County Park was another place I visited. Here I was located in this 11-acre prairie restoration right on the tip here by the bike path and the bridge over, oh gosh, Lake Wabeesa or Kegonsa. Just betrayed my my lack of knowledge about the 4 lakes. But here, Lake Farm County Park has a ton of adjacent wetland. All of this blue here is wetland, according to this tree canopy roster data set from the DNR. Here I found an abundant population of common garter snakes. So again, the common garter snakes I also found at UW Arboretum, Pheasant Branch, and Turville Point. These common garter snakes were the second most widely abundant species here in Madison that I found. And also I encountered them the most, just numerically. Encountered more of these than the brown snakes. The common garter snake is a really adaptable species. It's common, as in the name. It eats almost anything through the course of its life. When they're little, it'll mostly share the same sort of diet as a brown snake. They'll eat lots of invertebrates, slugs, worms. But then the moment they get bigger, all of that, the slug carbon that they've incorporated into their bodies gives them some wider jaws. They'll start taking amphibians. They'll even eat rodents. They get that big, and they'll also eat birds as well if you get a really big snake. So these common garter snakes, they're adaptable. They're common. They exist as well in pretty high population densities, and they also really like amphibians, especially. And so this makes sense that they would really like a place that's a grassland. It's dry, it's sunny, but that's right next to a bunch of wetland. And so here that is a perfect place to sun yourself, stay warm, keep dry, because Snakes also are susceptible to fungal infections, so they like to keep dry, but also that have lots of toads to eat. And something cool about the common garter snake is that they have adapted to feed on toads, and toads often have toxins in them. They secrete toxins from these glands on their shoulders. And so the garter snake has to be resistant to those toxins to prey on toads. The garter snake also does produce some venom that can incapacitate its prey. It doesn't really affect humans at all. So we only really discovered this until, just less than 20 years ago. But that makes the garter snake an interesting example of a snake that can be both venomous and poisonous, because the garter snake will actually obtain some of the toxins from the toads and especially newts that it eats, incorporate those into its own body. And so then if an eagle were to come through, or even like a small garter snake, even swallows and other birds will happily gobble up a garter snake. Those toxins will be within the snake and act as a poison, deterring predators. So there's often some confusion between what's venomous and what's poisonous. Being venomous, or I guess venom is injected. So if you think about fangs, they inject venom into you. Poison is just sort of a toxicity in tissues, or like a secreted poison. So the garter snake does both, which I think is pretty cool. On to the Uw Arboretum. Here, I had two different sites. One at Overlook Prairie, which is in the northern section of the Arboretum, right by the visitor center. It's not the famous Curtis Prairie, which is the birthplace of restoration ecology. It's just across the road from that. It's a tiny little 2.5 acre prairie that they let me kill a bunch of plants with my boards on. Green Prairie is a beautiful prairie restoration, just a few years younger than Curtis. And it's 20 acres. It's right here in the Grady tract of the Arboretum. So here I had boards as well. In the Arboretum, I found 3 different species, which is tied with pheasant branch, the highest species diversity I found here. So the common garter snake, we've already talked about. The Decay's brown snake, it's also here. A species that I found at the Arboretum and not elsewhere was the red-bellied snake, which you can see here. And unfortunately, I don't have a good picture of their underside. But if you imagine flipping this snake over, its scales are pretty much the color of this text here, really like blood red. And it uses that to scare predators away. It'll sort of play dead, and that bright color will flash. And lots of times people associate, or animals associate, those bright colors with being poisonous or toxic or otherwise inedible. So an interesting thing about the red-bellied snake is that my study wasn't very well constructed to find them. They're most likely, or they're usually more forest dwelling. And all of my boards were out in the middle of prairies. But they're very similar to the brown snake. They're in the same genus, Steraria. And so they also love worms and slugs. So again, pretty much wherever you're going to find worms and slugs, and as long as it's a little shadier and a little moister, red-bellied snakes would be happy. And so I did find one of these in Green Prairie while I was there. And the red-bellied snakes have been found regularly in the Arboretum. You look at iNaturalist, there was a study done in the Arboretum that was published this year by Aaron Crone, who looked at snakes eating invasive jumping worms. They found lots of red-bellied snakes, though they weren't as eager to eat the worms as the common garter snakes were. But again, that shows the use of snakes as well in our ecosystems as mesopredators for putting pressure on invasive species like worms that have been invading our woodland and that have been studied a fair bit in the Arboretum. I want to talk now about Pheasant Branch Conservancy. Like I said, this was the other site where I found 3 separate species. Again, the 2 regulars, the Decay's brown snake, the common garter snake. But this time I also found eastern milk snakes. Just to give you some idea of the site, it's another beautiful prairie. They have 125 acres, and I think growing at this point of prairie restoration. They also have some remnant prairie, which means that it's pretty much been intact for as long as people can remember, right up on the top of Fredericks Hill, which is You don't really see any topography in this map, but these trees up here are Frederick's Hill. And also it's sort of right on the edge of our urban matrix. There's a lot of farmland sort of directly adjacent to Pheasant Range. So that changes the dynamic a little bit of how snakes can get here. Like I said, I found here eastern milk snakes, and this is the only place I found milk snakes. They are really cool because they eat snakes. So they're part of this genus called Lampropeltis. They're also called king snakes. And just like king cobras eat other cobras, king snakes here in North America eat other snakes. So it's really cool to see some community interactions here that, you know, snakes are relying on other populations of snakes to survive. So these milk snakes exist happily at Pheasant Branch because there are plenty of brown snakes, plenty of garter snakes, and also ostensibly a number of red-bellied snakes there as well, but just in the woods instead of the prairie. So another interesting fact here is that these milk snakes really like Frederick's Hill. And there are some rock faces and crevices in Frederick's Hill that are potentially a hibernacula. And hibernacula are places that snakes hibernate. Just like a bear in the winter has to dig a hole or find a cave, snakes here in Wisconsin have to do something similar because it gets so cold here, and they, unlike bears, don't have a bunch of fat to burn to keep them warm. So they need to find really suitable places that are protected, but also have more of a stable thermal environment that they can use to survive the winter. So this is a really crucial part of where snakes can exist, because if you have everything a snake might want at a site that's isolated, maybe by roads or by other things, and there isn't a good place for them to survive the winter, you're not going to get any successful snake populations there, despite, you know, no matter how many slugs and worms and toads you have. So potentially a crucial hibernacula there on Frederick's Hill. Prairie Ridge Conservation Park is another one of those parks where I found one species I didn't find anywhere else. Prairie Ridge is a 48-acre prairie restoration. It's also right adjacent to an arboretum site called Pascflower Hill. This is right on Raymond Road, sort of south of town. Prairie Ridge Conservation Park, sort of like Pheasant Branch, has some historic prairie. It's considered a high lime goat prairie. And again, you can't see the topography on this map, but this is really steep right in here. It's a big hill or ridge, as in the name. And it's called this high lime, well, goat, because it's so steep, only goats could forage on it. I think that's the origin of that name. But also high lime because this ridge is just this limestone deposit. And the slope is so steep that you can't build up a whole lot of soil on it. And so this lack of soil, the bedrock right underneath creates this more arid environment because also it gets a lot of sun. So this more arid, thinner soil produces, or I guess lets species that are more common in the Western Great Plains and more arid environments compete well in this small little prairie restoration. And so that explains, to me at least, seemingly why we would find plains garter snakes only at this site as opposed to around Madison Moore, because the plains garter snake, this is about as far east as their range comes in Wisconsin. They're mainly a western, southern Great Plains species. So they just sort of interface with the range of the common garter snake here in Wisconsin. And they're both very similar. They eat pretty much the same things, that they look almost identical, but an interesting way that they differentiate, you know, usually people did, like, there are these things called ecological niches where, you know, every organism sort of has its cubby in an ecosystem. It has something that it does better than anything else. And usually that's defined by food. So, you know, if we think about like robins, we were talking about robins earlier, they eat worms. House sparrow is another bird. They eat your fries at the Union Terrace. So they don't really compete with each other very much. Here, the plains garter snake and the common garter snake eat pretty much the same things. The plains garter snake likes toads, plains garter snake likes worms and slugs. But the plains garter snake likes to be active in times that are hotter and drier than the common garter snake. So even in the same site, they won't compete with each other as much because the plains garter snake is going to be active during hotter and drier times of day than the common garter snake. So they can, in many ways, coexist different ecosystems. I didn't actually find any common garter snakes at Prairie Ridge, which I was surprised about, but they could be there, and they could be coexisting with the plains garter snake. Or it's also possible that the plains garter snake is just better suited to this environment because it is more like a Western plains environment. But I thought that was really cool when I found it because these snakes otherwise are almost impossible to distinguish. So I'm gonna quiz you all on it. So the name of this quiz is Garter Snake or Gardener Snake. And I named it this way because lots of people would come up to me and say, oh, have you been finding gardener snakes? I was like, yes, but they're really called garter snakes. And I hate to say that because I really do like the name gardener snake. I think it's more apt in this time than garter snake is, because garter snakes were named garter snakes back when garters were like a popular fashion item. And so people thought, oh, well, these garter snakes, they have stripes just like garters, I guess, give people stripes. So we don't wear garters much anymore, but we do garden a lot. And a lot of times we find garter snakes in the gardens, and they're really great to have in your garden. Like I said, they eat lots of worms and slugs and insects that would otherwise be eating your plants. So I do, go through this long story because the stripes still are important in distinguishing these two species. So the common garter snake, its stripe, it has this sort of lateral yellow stripe up the side. Its stripe is on the second and third scales up from its belly. The plains garter snake, really different. Its stripe is just on the third and fourth scales up from the belly. So as I was out there looking at snakes all the time last summer, I had to get pretty good at being able to tell which is which. And again, if you do find one in your garden, that's awesome. Make friends with it. So here comes the quiz. Like I said, the common garter snake, its stripe is on the second and third scales up from the belly. So I'll orient you here. These scales down here are the belly scales. So we got one scale up, two scales up, and three scales up. And we have this sort of yellow stripe right here. What do we think? Yeah, you're right, Doris. This is a common garter snake. And something that's really cool about this is that, the garter snake, the common garter snake, is the most cold adapted reptile in North America. You're going to find it at the highest latitudes of any reptile possibly in the world. I'm not sure about that, but definitely in North America. And it does that because it's really good at soaking up heat. So it has all these black scales on the top of its body that act like solar panels. That, even in winter, even in January, these snakes can crawl out of their hibernacula, soak up some sun on a clear day, and have enough heat to move around. On the other end of things, the plains garter snake is more of a heat adapted species. So we'll get into how their coloration is slightly different in a little bit, not to spoil the next slide. This snake here, again, just to remind you, second and third scales up from the belly, it's a common garter snake. Third and fourth scales up from the belly, it's a plains garter snake. And I apologize for the quality of this image. It wasn't as pixelated before. But again, to orient you, these are the belly scales here. There's a first level of scales, second level of scales, and then a third and a fourth level of scales. Here you can see this defined yellow band here in the third and fourth scales. What do we think this is? Plains garter snake. Yeah, you're right. So this here is a very grainy, blown up photo of a plains garter snake I found at Prairie Ridge. What's interesting here is that because this stripe is a little bit higher, it breaks up that solar panel right on the top of this snake. So it has less area of black scales that it's soaking up heat. And so on a hot day in the Great Plains, it's not going to overheat as easily as the common garter snake would, because it's not soaking up as much heat from all that black dark scales on its back. This makes it harder for the Plains garter snake to wake up in January in Wisconsin and go, I guess do whatever snakes do in January, because it's not going to soak up heat as readily from the sun. So again, this sort of shows the differences in the thermal niche of these two snakes, even though they're largely very similar otherwise. So Plains garter snake right here. What about this snake? Oh yeah, you jumped the gun on my joke here. This I was gonna walk you through all the scale levels and everything. No, you're right. This is a gardener snake, or some people call them hoses. Definitely find these a lot around Madison in gardens. It even has stripes too, similar coloration. Anyways, this is not a garter snake, a garden hose. All right, well, back to our tour of the different sites here. We have the Lakeshore Nature Preserve. I was in the Biocore Prairie, which is right here. All my boards were there. It's this beautiful 11-acre restoration. There's been an anecdotal lack of snakes in the preserve going back decades. And so sophomore year, when I was a biology student in the Biocore program, I was just coming off summers at the Urban Ecology Center in Milwaukee looking for snakes. And my professor, Seth McGee, was like, hey, well, we don't actually have any snakes here. And I was like, that doesn't make any sense. There's got to be snakes here. So that was one of the inspirations for this project. Because in Milwaukee, we were finding snakes in like old industrial sites. Figured the preserve would be a fantastic place for snakes to be in comparison to some of the sites in Milwaukee we were looking at. But there have only been 2 known confirmed sightings of snakes, and confirmed by photo. And this is from communication with Adam Gunlock, the land manager at the preserve. There was a common garter snake that he found at Willow Creek, which is sort of down off out of the frame here, and also an eastern fox snake that someone snapped a picture of at Picnic Point. But other than that, we don't have any recordings of snakes at all in the preserve. Someone who's with us tonight emailed me and said that he's been walking in the preserve since the 70s and hasn't seen a snake at all in even hundreds or thousands of times in the preserve. So it seems to be a well-known phenomenon. And surprise, surprise, I didn't find any either in just one summer of sampling. And this remains a mystery, why there are no snakes in the preserve. Because just looking at the preserve itself, it should have everything that snakes would desire. Maybe minus a hibernacula, but that's harder to find than just looking at the toads and the wetland and the prairie itself and all of the great natural area that the preserve has. So speaking of not finding things, there are also a number of species that I thought I could maybe find that I didn't. So I want to briefly talk about those. The American or blue racer is a really beautiful aerobic hunter. It speeds through the grass after larger prey like amphibians and rodents. It's also known to use cover boards, so I could have found it. But the nearest reports to Madison are in Arena on Naturalist, so a little far out from here. Unfortunately, all these snakes here are larger bodied snakes, and the larger the snake, the more it's going to move around, the more range it needs, the more likely it is to get hit by a car here in Madison. So the chances of finding these large snakes are definitely less likely than the small bodied snakes that I've been talking about and finding regularly. The gopher snake is the largest snake in Wisconsin. There was one reported just 5 kilometers west of Prairie Ridge, which I thought was really cool that some of these are coming in so close. But again, it's so big, it's got to move a little more than just a little brown snake. And the more you're moving, the more you're likely to run into a road here in Madison. It's also species, all of these, or at least the racer and the gopher snake are species of special concern, likely because they're more likely to be killed by humans. Northern water snake is actually pretty common here in Madison, relatively, but it's an aquatic species. So I was looking in prairies and wasn't really expecting to find them, because if I were looking for them specifically, I'd be looking on shorelines and in the water. These are often mistaken for cottonmouths. They're not. They would hurt if they bit you, but also if you don't mess with them, they're not going to bite you. The fox snake is the true surprise. I really thought I was going to find some fox snakes, especially because there was one reported at Picnic Point, but I didn't. There's also lots of them at Cherokee Marsh, as reported on iNaturalist. And in some previous studies, they're usually detected in coverboard surveys. This is a little bit south of here in wider open range prairie. So it's also possible that they're more able to survive there because of the lack of road collisions and other urban hazards. The eastern hognose snake we talked about a bit earlier. This is the one species that just does not use coverboards. This is a known fact. So my study was not well equipped to find these, but there is one reported in sort of the metropolitan Madison area near the Madison Parks Heritage Prairie, just on the other side of the highway there. So whether they'd even be able to make it to Heritage Prairie, I don't know, but there was a sighting. So I want to wrap up this talk here tonight with some thoughts on snakes and their importance in urban restoration ecology. So I want to say, again, snakes are integral to our native Wisconsin ecosystems. And as we think about, what restoration even means, what the goals of restoration are, I think usually it's to create, recreate what the same sort of functions and systems we see in our intact native ecosystems, either presently or somewhere in the past, as defined by whoever is doing restoration ecology. In our intact native ecosystems, snakes are abundant exothermic mesopredators. So we'll walk through those terms again. Abundant, some snakes, there have been studies of the Plains Garter Snake that they found 850 individuals in a single hectare. So lots of snakes, small area. They're exothermic, which allows them to do that. It means they don't need enough food or as much food to maintain a large abundance and a large biomass as a similar flock of robins or a similar scurrying group of voles. They're also mesopredators. As I said, all snakes are predatory. They're going to eat all sorts of critters below them in the trophic level, and they're going to facilitate that transfer of energy up through the trophic pyramid, preserving a lot of the biomass that they've maintained because they're not burning it to keep them warm, and they're feeding a lot of the apex predators up at the top, like eagles and coyotes. So they're really crucial just in energy flow from the bottom of this pyramid up to the top. But they also are really impacted by our urban environments, as was determined globally by that Cox study, and also more locally by a bunch of other studies about snake interactions with roads, pesticides, all sorts of things, including ourselves and our pets often kill lots of snakes. Despite that, our urban environments are still relevant. There still are lots of these beautiful pockets of pristine or near pristine prairie restorations and preserves of all different sorts. It's just a matter of with urban snakes facing reduced mobility and increased mortality, can we just assume that they exist in these beautiful places that we've created in rewilding our urban spaces? Can we just assume that because they exist in the county that they're going to exist in our favorite park or in our backyard? From the results of my study, which was just 1 year, I'm going to say no. We need to go out and look for them, right? And we need to confirm whether or not they actually exist, because chances are, if snakes were extirpated from a site, or that means that they were there once but then all died off, even if we restore the prairie to its former glory, maybe those snakes just can't cross the road to get there. So I want to end this with just stating that snakes have been overlooked, undervalued, and understudied in Madison. And I think that's really crazy, because Madison, of course, is the home of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, as well as the proudly proclaimed the birthplace of restoration ecology with Aldo Leopold and the Arboretum. And snakes are so important to restoration ecology and our native ecosystems. We really should know more about the snakes we have around us here. And so I hope that this baseline information I've collected last summer, and I'm still continuing to do in the preserve, because I will find snakes in the preserve if they're there. I hope this information can help inform those needed future investigations and conservation action. So thank you all for listening to me tonight. And I also want to thank a bunch of people. Oh no. Shoot. Well, my acknowledgement slide is great. Well, I'm sorry. There were so many people to help me with this project, including my advisor, Catherine Woodward, a number of other advisors, Professor Seth McGee, the herpetologist I mentioned earlier, Dr. Gary Casper, and Robert Hay. Also, thanks to Nicholas Cooler with the statistics department here for helping me do a little bit of statistics work here with the snakes. Also, all of the land managers and other project facilitators I worked with at the Lakeshore Nature Preserve, Dane County Parks, Madison City Parks, the Arboretum. Thanks so much for making this project possible. And I also want to thank all the people that helped me with the boards, including friends, interested community members, and also a number of members of my own family that have helped me out with this. So thanks to everyone, and thank you all again for coming to my talk.
Awesome, thank you. Does anyone have any questions?
Question.
What's the nature of the cover board so that the snakes can hide under it? I mean, give an explanation of what that is.
Great question. So the question was, why do snakes like to use cover boards? And that's a really pertinent question. So the boards themselves are 3/4 inch plywood, about 3 by 4 feet, and they are insulating enough that they provide a nice, stable thermal environment underneath them. And so the snakes like to crawl under the boards, not just for the cover that they provide, right? If they're hiding from birds or other predators, that's cover board's going to protect them mostly. It also provides just a nice little micro environment, whether it's cooler or warmer than the surrounding air temperature, because snakes, they have to regulate based on where they are. So if that snake's feeling too hot, it can sort of hide under in the shade of the board. Or if it's feeling too cold, it can soak up some of the heat coming off of that board that the board has collected from the sun throughout the day. So I would normally check them in the evening between 4 p.m. and around 9 p.m. So this is when the boards have collected a lot of heat from the day and are then letting them out, or letting that heat out. And the snakes have largely fed and are looking for a place to digest. And these boards are a safe, thermally stable place for them to do that. So of course, that's the time when I jump on them. But yes, another question.
So are the snakes in the prairie at risk when the prairies are burned?
Another great question. So I've talked with Adam Gunlock about this at the Lakeshore Nature Preserve. He does lots of burns there. And they usually, it's sort of common practice when you're burning a prairie that you leave a section of it unburned so that the animals and other creatures that live in that prairie can have a place to wait out the fire. It's also really amazing just what topsoil can do in insulating. So rodents do this all the time. They'll just be a few inches down below the topsoil in their burrows, and the fire will burn clean over them and they'll be fine. So snakes will also use burrows and things, but like I said, they've been with us here in our native ecosystems since the glaciers receded. They definitely have adaptations to dealing with fire. They're also really good at smelling. I didn't really touch on this at all in the presentation, but that's why a snake's tongue keeps on going out and in all the time, because it's sensing all of the scents in the air with that forked tongue. So they can probably smell the smoke as well before you or I would be able to.
What are your plans for the future? Are you going to further education, do more of these studies? What are your plans?
Yeah, thank you. The question was, what are my plans for the future? I'm still figuring that out. I currently work in a sort of an unrelated field. I work at the David O'Connor lab at Research Park. We're doing lots of COVID genomic surveillance. I find that really fascinating. I also find this work with snakes really fascinating. I haven't made up my mind. And there are lots of other places to go. But I think I will eventually go to grad school once I have an idea of exactly what path I want to take.
It seems like the snakes need you.
Well, individually, I think the snakes would have been just happy without me, messing with them and all that. But definitely on a human knowledge sort of perspective, right? I think, there is still lots to be learned about snakes. So thanks for the question. questions from,
Questions in the chat. The first one is, can the toxin in garter snakes be used as an antidote for all snake bites? For each snake toxin differ in their toxin intensity. The antidotes are unique to each poisonous or venomous snake.
yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for that. So the question was, with like antidotes to snake toxin, can one toxin sort of be the antidote for all other toxins? How that's done is usually in the creation of an antidote for a snake venom. They will use another animal, I think usually like a horse, that can create antibodies against the active ingredients in that toxin. And so they'll use another animal to make those antibodies, just like, you know, in COVID, we're talking a lot about antibodies that will just like attack either the virus or the protein in the snake venom that's causing the bad effects. So if you're then injected with those antibodies that are primed to go and take out those snake poison molecules, that's how the antidote works. And so unfortunately, you'll often need specific antibodies for specific venoms. So, and I guess like there really would be no reason to have an antivenom for garter snakes, because again, they don't really have any medical import on human health. But like for a timber rattlesnake especially, yeah, you'd want some timber rattlesnake specific antivenom for sure. Thanks for the question.
Awesome. And then there's another question. If you had the opportunity to do this project another summer, what would you do differently?
I'd have more help. The question was, if I were to do this again another summer, what would I do differently? Yeah, I wouldn't do this all myself. Yeah, and I think, you know, I try to, originally I wanted this study to have more statistical import, but it's really tough to do that with only a sample size of 8. I had 8 different prairies. There are studies that have compared snake species occupancy to age or to landscape factors in the surrounding area, determining if, you know, certain species are there because of certain reasons. You need like 10 times the amount of samples that I had in this study. So I would have more sites and definitely more help. Thanks for the question.
Last one. Tom wants to know if you can tell folks more about your role with the board of the Friends of the Lakeshore Preserve.
Yeah, thank you, Tom, for that question. So I'm also in addition to looking for snakes and doing some COVID research, I'm also the president of the Friends of the Lakeshore Nature Preserve. The Friends of the Lakeshore Nature Preserve, we're a nonprofit organization whose mission is to inspire people to care for and connect with the preserve. We work in tandem and more just as a helping aid to the university staff, Laura Wyatt, Bryn Scriver, and Adam Gunlock, who run the preserve. We just are a community organization that really cares for the preserve and help them in any way that we can. So Tom is also on our board, and we do lots of really cool events, field trips out in the preserve. We are releasing our fall newsletter really soon. That's going to detail a lot of these cool trips we have lined up. We do bird walks. We do different educational tours about the marsh or geology or history of the preserve. We also have a number of writing events coming up, including a poetry open mic, and we're also developing a poetry audio trail in the preserve. So check us out at Friends of the Lakeshore Nature Preserve on our website. Thanks for the question, Tom. Another question here.
Would the larger snakes that need larger territories be candidates to use a wildlife corridor under a road or over a road, presuming that such were built?
Yeah, so that's thank you for the question. The question was for those larger snake species that are going to be crossing more roads, what sorts of things can be done, and would a wildlife corridor or crossing over busy roads or under busy roads be helpful? Yes. There are lots of, and this is, I think, definitely more of a thing the farther south you go in the United States, where they have more big snakes and other sort of reptiles and amphibians and creatures. But yes, so it's kind of it doesn't always work 100%, but sometimes it has been proven successful that if you have a tunnel under a road or some other way for animals to bypass the road itself, that can help with the dispersion of species or just their usual movement. So that is one way that people have used to try to make urban spaces more friendly for snakes. Thank you for the question.
Thank you very much.